What if 5 American cities weren't built independently, but on top of the same architectural plan? Not similar style, not shared inspiration, the same proportions, the same structural geometry, the same underground orientation. And what if those foundations were never meant to be compared? When historians describe the rapid expansion of American cities in the late 19th century, they focus on what rose upward: steel frames, brick corridors, expanding rail lines, industrial ambition. But beneath that narrative, beneath the visible skyline, something else appears in scattered excavation reports between 1870 and 1905. Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, Boston, San Francisco, 5 cities, different regions, different histories, different settlement timelines. Yet the same language appears in municipal records. Here's pre-existing structures. Unexpected depth. More elaborate than projected. Individually, those phrases mean nothing. Together, they begin to repeat. In Cleveland, engineers preparing foundations for civic expansion reported chambers beneath predicted bedrock levels. In Chicago, sewer projects uncovered arched corridors misclassified as abandoned substructures. In St. Louis, bridge reinforcement crews documented stone platforms extending beyond mapped grids. Boston's transit excavation revealed vaulting inconsistent with colonial construction. San Francisco's reconstruction efforts after fire exposed stonework beneath ash layers that did not match frontier techniques. Each case was resolved locally. Each explanation was practical. Each anomaly was contained. But when compared side by side, the contradictions begin to align. The first anomaly is depth. Across all 5 cities, underground structures appeared several meters below expected foundation layers. Not shallow basements, not forgotten cellars. Deeper. Deep enough that standard urban accumulation cannot easily explain burial. If sediment gradually raised street levels, depth would vary by district. But excavation photographs show something more consistent. Similar depth intervals. Similar transition points between modern fill and earlier stonework. Why would 5 unrelated cities share comparable subterranean layering? The second anomaly is orientation. Foundation walls discovered beneath downtown Cleveland followed a geometric bearing mirrored in deeper Chicago findings. In Boston, older stone corridors aligned along axes that did not correspond to modern street grids, but echoed orientations discovered in St. Louis bridge substructures. Different planners should not produce identical subsurface alignment, unless they were building over something already aligned. In Chicago, late 19th century reports from sewer expansion projects reference arched masonry encountered beneath commercial districts. The arches were described as structurally excessive for simple drainage. In Cleveland, similar vault curvature was photographed in chambers classified as earlier construction. In San Francisco, reconstruction surveys after 1906 mention stone vaulting below expected fire debris layers. Arches are not rare in architecture, but the curvature ratios, measured from surviving photographs, appear strikingly consistent. Coincidence? Possibly. But coincidence repeated across cities begins to resemble pattern. The third anomaly is load-bearing capacity. Engineers in St. Louis noted platforms capable of supporting far greater weight than structures above them required. Boston Transit excavation teams described stone bases of unusual thickness beneath modest colonial-era buildings. In Cleveland, certain lower strata were engineered to carry loads exceeding what 19th century warehouses demanded. Why would early builders over-engineer foundations to that extent? Perhaps future-proofing. Perhaps reuse. Or perhaps those foundations once supported something larger. Another contradiction emerges in decorative refinement. Excavation imagery from Cleveland shows carved limestone blocks with minimal mortar visibility. In Chicago, subterranean masonry revealed decorative moldings inconsistent with purely utilitarian use. Boston's buried arches included carved stone details typically reserved for visible facades. San Francisco crews documented dressed stone beneath rubble layers that did not resemble hastily constructed frontier substructures. Basements are rarely ornate. Utility corridors are rarely symmetrical. Why do buried levels exhibit aesthetic intention? In Cleveland's internal records, the phrase pre-existing structures appears repeatedly Yeni Metin Belgesi. In Chicago's municipal documents from similar years, terminology shifts from natural obstruction to earlier foundation. In Boston archives, minutes refer vaguely to old masonry of unknown origin. Each city uses different wording, yet the hesitation feels similar. Language becomes guarded when clarity fails, and clarity fails when explanation is incomplete. The time window is another alignment. Most discoveries occurred between roughly 1870 and 1905. Infrastructure modernization projects, sewer installations, transit systems, post-fire reconstruction, civic expansion, 5 cities, same industrial acceleration period, same burst of excavation, same buried anomalies. If such foundations existed for decades prior, why do they only surface prominently during this period? Because this is when cities dug deeper, and when they dug deeper, something else appeared. In St. Louis, bridge anchoring projects uncovered stonework beneath river-adjacent districts that did not correspond to mapped construction phases. In Boston, subway expansion revealed voids sealed with compacted material rather than collapsed debris. In Chicago, regrading projects exposed partial lower floors later reclassified as basements. Reclassification appears repeatedly. First floors become basements. Foundations become remnants. Ornate chambers become storage voids. Language shifts downward. Another contradiction lies in uniform proportion. Photographic analysis of surviving underground arches across multiple cities reveals similar span-to-height ratios. The curvature geometry appears mathematically consistent. Independent masons working decades apart in cities thousands of miles apart should not replicate identical engineering proportions without shared templates. Were such templates circulating nationally? Architectural pattern books existed, but pattern books influenced visible structures. These are buried ones. If visible architecture spread through publication, why would hidden foundations follow identical ratios? Unless the foundations predate the pattern books, or unless the pattern books derived from something older. Water erosion marks provide another point of alignment. In Cleveland, lower limestone surfaces displayed polish consistent with prolonged moisture exposure, Yeni Metan Belgesi. Chicago's subterranean vaults showed similar smoothing patterns. Boston transit excavations reported mineral deposits on lower stone faces, inconsistent with typical basement dampness. San Francisco reconstruction teams documented sediment layering beneath stone that suggested saturation prior to fire debris. 5 cities. Similar moisture patterns. No unified flood event documented across all 5 within that time window. Urban flooding occurs, but synchronized subterranean water exposure across geographically distinct regions demands either coincidence or shared environmental event. No national geological report from that era records such uniformity. In each city, excavation eventually stopped. Not completed. Not fully documented. Stopped. Cleveland's deeper chambers were backfilled during expansion Yeni Metin Belgesi. Chicago sewer projects sealed certain vaulted corridors, Boston transit routes adjusted to avoid specific lower anomalies. San Francisco reconstruction prioritized stability over exploration. St. Louis bridge reinforcement redirected around unmapped substructures. Why redirect rather than investigate? Time pressure, budget constraints, structural safety, all plausible. But when redirection consistently avoids deeper, more refined stonework, patterns sharpen. Another anomaly lies in documentation gaps. Municipal archives from the late 19th century are typically meticulous. Permits, contractor lists, expenditure breakdowns. Yet references explaining origins of certain underground structures are often vague or absent. Photographs exist, but wide-angle documentation is rare. Reports mention obstructions without detailed diagrams. Gaps individually mean nothing. Collectively, they suggest selective compression. The blueprint question emerges slowly. Not a literal blueprint on paper. A geometric blueprint embedded in stone. When structural engineers compare archived measurements from different cities, certain ratios repeat. Column spacing beneath St. Louis districts approximates spacing in Cleveland's buried chambers. Arch height in Boston mirrors curvature in Chicago's substructures. San Francisco's pre-fire stonework beneath reconstruction zones shows similar block dimensions. Block size repetition is difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. Stone quarries vary by region. Material type differs, yet cut proportions align. How? Were masons trained from a centralized institution disseminating standardized underground architecture across multiple cities before official founding narratives stabilized? Or were later builders constructing over a pre-existing standardized network? Both possibilities challenge conventional timelines. Another contradiction involves street elevation. Many of these cities experienced regrading projects during modernization. Streets rose. First floors descended into basement status. But when examining earliest photographs, some buried lower levels appear too refined to have been intended as basements originally. If streets rose due to infrastructure upgrades, why do lower facades retain decorative detail inconsistent with subterranean design? Because they were once above ground. If so, what raised the ground uniformly across districts? Urban fill is one answer, but fill requires transport. Transport requires documentation. Documentation is uneven. In Chicago, some records detail street elevation. In Cleveland, large-scale fill documentation is sparse relative to visual evidence. Boston's regrading appears piecemeal, yet results in consistent burial depth across certain neighborhoods. Uniform burial depth across 5 cities remains difficult to explain with purely local adjustments. Another layer of contradiction lies in structural continuity. In Cleveland, deeper walls align directly beneath later commercial blocks, Yeni Metin Belgesi. In Chicago, substructures mirror upper grid patterns despite official narratives placing foundational work decades later. In Boston, transit excavations revealed alignment between buried arches and modern street axes inconsistent with supposed independent planning stages. Alignment suggests inheritance. Inheritance implies visibility. Visibility implies awareness. If later builders saw and followed existing geometry, where is documentation acknowledging that inheritance? Silence again. The era matters. Between 1870 and 1905, America transitioned from regional expansion to industrial consolidation. Rail networks unified commerce. Engineering standards became nationalized. But underground classical stonework appearing simultaneously across 5 cities suggests coordination earlier than that industrial unification. If coordination existed earlier, who coordinated? Architectural guilds, federal oversight, private industrial networks. No surviving record points clearly to any. Yet proportions persist. Ratios repeat. Depth aligns. And the deeper the excavation, the less documentation accompanies it. Another pattern appears in subsequent destruction. Some underground chambers in Chicago were demolished during later development without preservation attempt. Cleveland's deeper ornate sections were sealed rather than studied yeni metin belgesi. Boston Transit reroutes avoided certain voids instead of integrating them. San Francisco reconstruction removed or covered lower stone layers. Removal without analysis is not unusual during rapid modernization, but uniform avoidance across 5 cities suggests more than inconvenience. It suggests irrelevance to official narrative, or incompatibility. Imagine overlaying maps of these 5 cities and plotting discovered underground arches, vaults, and stone platforms. Points begin to cluster around early trade corridors and port districts. The same types of districts, the same economic nodes. If these were merely abandoned basements from early settlers, distribution would be irregular. Instead, the pattern resembles a network, not visible above ground, but traceable beneath. Could 5 cities share architectural inheritance from a single design philosophy? Certainly. Could they share pre-existing substructures predating official founding phases? Possibly. Could those substructures reflect a unified engineering tradition unrecorded in mainstream history? That is harder to dismiss, and yet, no conclusive evidence names such a tradition. No master architect appears in textbooks. No national excavation report consolidates findings. Each city retains its own explanation. Local, contained, independent. Independence is comfortable. Pattern is unsettling, because if Cleveland's sealed classical foundations, yeni metin belgesi, align proportionally with Chicago's buried vaults, and Boston's subterranean arches mirror St. Louis's load-bearing platforms and San Francisco's pre-fire stonework echoes the same geometry, then independence dissolves, and blueprint emerges, not as theory, as repetition. 5 cities, same depth intervals, same curvature ratios, same block proportions, same era of discovery, same eventual sealing. If coincidence, it is a remarkable one. If pattern, it is an incomplete one. No official conclusion connects them. No centralized study compares them. No definitive explanation unifies the anomalies. Perhaps because the anomalies remain fragmentary. Or perhaps because comparison invites questions beyond infrastructure. If 5 American cities share underground classical foundations with identical geometric logic, who designed that logic? When was it implemented? And why does documentation consistently narrow just as excavation reaches its most refined layers? The official explanations remain individually plausible. The collective alignment remains unresolved. The foundations are still there. In some cities sealed, in others destroyed, in others forgotten. But if they share the same proportions, the same era, the same buried refinement, then the question is not whether classical foundations were found beneath 5 cities. The question is why they look as though they were built from the same plan, and who drew it. No record answers that. Not yet.